Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to be able to kick off the fall lecture series. Shh. Yeah, there we go. That always works. So, this is something that's very special that we do in the school, which is to bring outside voices into our conversations that we're having in the classroom and in the hallways. And we're blessed with five speakers, four speakers, five, five speakers this fall, um, coming to us with diverse perspectives, really interesting practices, decades of architectural practice, and ideas which are sometimes aligned with our own, but at other times challenge some of the assumptions that we make. And that is the purpose of bringing these visitors, is so that we can have conversation with people who have different experiences and ideas and enrich our own in that conversation. So tonight we have David Mayernik, who's a very old friend, someone I've worked closely with, someone whose career I've admired from a distance, and we're really lucky to have him here this evening to talk to us about his career. CJ will introduce him, so I won't take any of that away, but I want to say, David, how pleased I am that you're here with us tonight. Thank you.
So thank you, Mark, very much. Good evening, everybody. My name is CJ Howard. I'm the acting director of the classical concentration here at the School of Architecture at the Catholic University of America. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you the first lecture in our fall lecture series. This semester, the classical concentration is blessed to have as a visiting critic a truly exceptional figure in David Mayernik. Tonight, you will come to learn about the breadth and depth of his engagement with architecture. David Mayernik is a fellow of the American Academy in Rome and the British Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures, and Commerce, and has won numerous grants, awards, and competitions, including the Gabriel Prize for Research in France, the Steedman Competition, and Fellowship to the American Academy in Rome, and at 26, the International Minnesota State Capitol Grounds Competition, with then-partner Thomas Norman Reikovich. That project won an Arthur Ross Award from Classical America. In 1995, he was named to the decennial list of the top 40 architects in the United States under 40. His ongoing design work for the TASIS campus in Switzerland over almost 3 decades has been recognized with the Palladio Award from the Traditional Building magazine, an honorable mention in the Intbau Excellence Awards, and a jury prize from the Prix European d'Architecture Philippe Rothier. TASIS Switzerland was named one of the 9 most beautiful boarding schools in the world by AD Magazine in March 2024, and has been featured in a variety of publications, including Traditional Architecture, Timeless Building for the 21st Century, and New Palladians. For 10 years, he has also designed a series of new buildings for TASIS England in Surrey. David Mayernik studied fresco painting with the renowned restorer Leonetto Tintori and has painted frescoes for the American Academy in Rome, churches in Tuscany and Ticino, and his own buildings at TASIS, Switzerland. He designed stage sets for the Haymarket Opera Company of Chicago for 4 seasons between 2012 and 2014. He won the competition to paint the Palio for his adopted home of Lucca in 2013. His drawings and paintings have been exhibited in New York, Chicago, London, Innsbruck, Rome, and Padova, and featured in various magazines, including American Artist and Fine Art Connoisseur. In the fall of 2022, he was a resident at the Bogliasco Foundation in Liguria and the Cini Foundation in Venice. David Mayernik is Associate Professor Emeritus at University of Notre Dame, where for over 20 years he taught in the School of Architecture. He is the author of 2 books, The Challenge of Emulation in Art and Architecture, and Timeless Cities, an Architect's Reflection on Renaissance Italy, and numerous essays and book chapters, including The Baroque City, which our studio has read this semester as part of their project work. His reconstruction of the Nymphaeum by Bramante and Genzano, will be published this fall in the Memoirs of the American Academy in Rome. In 2016, he created the online course, The Meaning of Rome for Notre Dame, hosted on the edX platform, which had an audience of 6,000 followers when it was live. It is still available on edX in an archive version. To best describe David, I would use two words: Renaissance man. He's an artist, designer, author, and educator. I would be remiss not to mention that he has also been a personal inspiration of mine as a former professor and someone I seek to emulate in practice and in teaching. It has been a treat to continue to learn from him and have him in the studio assisting the graduate students in their own educational growth. I trust everyone here tonight will likewise benefit in learning from him in his lecture entitled Projects Real and Fantastical, The Life of an Architect. With that, please help me in joining and welcoming David to the stage.
What a great pleasure it is to be here, and first to be introduced by Mark, who he didn't say we're friends. I'm happy to say that, but he was my boss for 5 years in New York, and CJ, as he said, was a student, and but at the graduate level, which means we were it was much more of a conversation than a lecturing kind of format. And so I have a history with a number of people here, and it's wonderful to connect with them, but also to meet all of you and to meet the students I've been teaching this semester and to get to know the students and for you to get to know me. And you know, the thing is, at a certain point in my life, where I don't want to say I'm that old, but I mean, I have retired from Notre Dame, that I'm going to give a lecture that is really not so much about the projects I'm going to show, which I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to move through them pretty quickly. What I'm actually lecturing about is a way of being an architect and the kind of things that I feel like are essentially incumbent on me, given how I see myself with respect to the past. And in that sense, you know, there's a lot of talk online about, you know, work-life balance and that architects have this, you know, work-life balance problem. This is about a work-work balance, two different kinds of work that I do as an architect. Projects that are real, things that I've been able to build over the last roughly 30 years, before, after having worked in the profession for other people and doing things under somebody else's name, and then things that I've done that no one's asked me to do, that are essentially theoretical projects or investigations of my own that matter to me, and that I would like to believe make me a better architect. Oh. Just kidding. So, okay.
And click this.
Okay. So the project's real part of it. I'm going to start with the real stuff. And partly because that's, you know, my day job. It's what I do every day these days. When I'm not here, I'm working for TASIS. We're building a number of buildings. You saw a video that was looping before we got started that essentially was produced for the latest iteration of our master plan, which has gone through a variety of iterations. I'll talk about that briefly, but those iterations have yielded essentially the final version of it that we're essentially committed to and that we're building actually right now. There are two major projects, one big project, one smaller project under construction, and a few others. And eventually, though, it'll all end and I'll just walk off into the sunset, and that will be the end of my time with TASIS. I've been fortunate in that sense, though, to work with a client I'm going to talk about in a bit. But at the same time, I want to, and I don't want to make apologies for what I've been able to do. But I do want to say that it's hard building today for a variety of reasons. And what I've been able to do, I think, is the best I can get away with. Andy Warhol said that art is what I can get away with. And I feel like that's true about my architecture. This is what I've been able to do. But the last part of the lecture is about what I would like to be able to do. The thing about architecture is, unless you're very wealthy, you don't work for yourself, you work for other people. And for better or worse, those people have a major impact on what an architect is able to do. I've been fortunate to work for the woman on the right, who's the daughter of the woman on the left, who's the executive director of the TASIS schools. TASIS was founded by her mother, M. Christ Fleming, there on the left. That was for her 80th birthday, by the way. She lived to be 98. But around that time, in her 80s, she handed off the reins to her daughter, Lynn. And Lynn had grown up
essentially with her mother buying old buildings around Europe and turning them into schools. And she was sort of an educational entrepreneur. You could say she was an educational gambler. She won just slightly more than 50% of the time. So some of her ventures failed and some of them succeeded. The two that succeeded are the ones where I'm continuing to have been working over the last 30 years. She had a chateau in France that was supposed to be a school that went belly up because it was in the middle of nowhere, and it was lovely to be at the chateau, but there was not much to do out there. She had a school in Greece at one point. She started a college in Florence that lasted about 2 years. She started a college down the road, really, from the school in Switzerland, the high school in Switzerland, that had a revolt of the faculty in 1968, which happened a lot around Europe. And she basically folded the school, and it was essentially bought by the faculty. So she was an entrepreneur, and her mother, her daughter, essentially inherited the school, but also grew up around construction sites. So Lynn has been an incredibly informed client, occasionally a collaborator, but I know Andreas Dewani likes to say that never let your client pick up a pencil. And it's great to have a client who knows about architecture. It's another thing to have a client who thinks they're an architect. And trust me, I've worked for those, and it is challenging. So the first campus I'm going to talk about is Tassis, England, which I began with just after I began working for Lynn in Switzerland. Tassis, England was founded by Mrs. Fleming in 1976. It happens to be coincidentally the year that England joined the European Economic Union. And the school took off largely because it was only about 20 minutes away from Heathrow Airport. And lots of American companies especially wanted to have headquarters ostensibly in Europe in an English-speaking country. And so lots of their kids wanted to go to American schools. And so Tassis was there to fill that need. Mrs. Fleming essentially bought an old English village of Thorpe, which is about 10 kilometers from Windsor. We're near Eton College, but the little village of Thorpe. She essentially bought the core of this English village, renovated buildings. And then in the 1980s, when they were really growing and they had outgrown all the existing buildings, they're in the London Greenbelt. So you may or may not know that London in 1948 essentially passed a law establishing a green belt around the city of London that was meant to, one, stop London from sprawling all the way to Reading, but also to preserve the landscape immediately around London and to give Londoners access to that landscape. And Surrey's a big part of that landscape. And so what they did is they essentially made exceptions within an existing village envelope. So if you're within an existing village envelope, you could build. Otherwise, you were supposed to not essentially be able to build in the green belt. Of course, lots of stress and pressure on that policy, which is essentially maintained by what they call planning officers in England, who are essentially bureaucrats and basically empowered, you could say burdened with the task of essentially defending the green belt based on their judgment of what should be allowed. But essentially, you could build within the village envelope. Well, the school tested that idea by building what I would call mushroom buildings, these low buildings with one-story eaves and lots of roof volume that were meant to be kind of low-slung, non-invasive intrusions into the greenbelt. But eventually, the borough of Runnymede, where they happen to be found, borough of Runnymede, by the way, is where the Magna Carta was signed. The borough actually drew a line around the edges of all the buildings they built in the 1980s and said, you cannot go past this line. So they literally discipline the school into saying anything more you do has to be essentially infill. And so that was my challenge, was essentially allowing the school to grow, improving facilities, building new facilities that they didn't have, or improving the ones that they already had within that boundary. And so we started by very modest intervention. Those kind of almost dormer-like wings onto the art wing there were better art studio spaces. So higher roof volume, better ceilings, better light for the art studios. They had an excellent art program led by a wonderful American painter named John Smalley, who was just fantastic. And so that was the first intervention. We got away with that. And then the school decided to sort of test the limits. And so we built all of that onto the gymnasium that they'd also built in the 80s. So more gym space, changing rooms, a bigger kind of addition to the gym, or essentially a gymnastics room that they could do other kind of functions other than a basketball court. But all of that, especially the stuff on the upper right bit of that, was essentially beyond the boundary where we were theoretically allowed to build. But we got away with it because it was done sensitively enough, in fact, to actually improve the prospect of that side of the building. So, emboldened by that, we started doing more things. This thing was in addition to an existing classroom wing for English as a second language teaching. And so what I thought of that we were doing essentially at this point on was essentially plugging the gaps in a series of loosely organized buildings that had not necessarily positive open space that they defined, and inserting buildings, plugging in the gaps, adding on to things to create more positive, more appealing, but also better defined and more useful outdoor space. So that's the beginning of that. And then we started working around this building. So the building above that white circle at the top there is an 18th century listed English country house, manor house, essentially on the edge of the village of Thorpe, which is the elementary school. So the elementary kids actually have the best building on campus. And it had a coach house. So the building to the right of that circle I just showed was a coach house attached onto a wing of that house built in the 19th century. And we began to add wings onto that coach house that essentially established a courtyard in front of the coach house, but also began to describe a green to the right side of that on the back side of this 17th century house here down on the road. So the last of those buildings was a science building. So the two buildings that surround the courtyard, the first one that we built was a health center. So it had some health center functions, nurse's office and some recovery spaces for kids who were ill, and some classroom space up above. And then in that plug in the gap between that coach house and an arcaded building, more classroom space. And then below that, the larger circle below that was an upper school building, essentially a dedicated building that gave it a kind of an identity, offices and meeting hall for the upper school of this boarding school. It's also a day school, though, so it has from pre-K through high school. The boarding students tend to be all high school students. And we were able to create that green by then adding that science building on the other side. Across the road, they have a bigger 19th century Regency country house called Thorpe House, Thorpe Place. Thorpe House is the one across the road. And in that blue circle, you could see we were actually completely off limits in a protected part of the landscape around the school. And we got away with being able to build that building, which actually CJ helped me with the drawings for this, because it was sympathetic to the character of the bigger, larger, much larger 19th century Regency house in kind of yellow brick. And it also created positive space behind it. We called it the cloisters because it actually created a little cloister court. There's a little chapel on the backside of that 19th century manor house. And so we were actually able to do a lot because the planning authorities, who basically should have said no to much of this building, believed that it was actually sympathetic and was a positive contribution to the environment. And so they actually allowed us to do more than we should have legally been allowed to do. And that included also demolishing trees, because not only does England protect buildings, they protect trees. Virtually every building on that north side of the campus was under what they call a tree protection order. So every tree that we got rid of, we had to replace with multiple additional trees elsewhere. But we're able to do that by essentially the quality of what we proposed. The one bit of this that I designed that was never built was supposed to be the head of, or the main building for the middle school, to give an identity to that middle school wing, which extends up there to the top of the drawing. So I did that for about 10 years. And I wouldn't say I had a falling out, but it was not the same direction as the school in Switzerland. Lynn Fleming Eshelman, the daughter of the founder of the school, was not the director of the school in England. The director of the school in England actually had done an undergraduate at Harvard with some courses in architecture and 1 year at the GSD. And he really did think he was an architect. He also had a penchant for, let's say, undermining the quality of construction. And because I am not a licensed architect in England, I had to collaborate with British architects. He would get involved and basically sort of sacrifice some of the quality of construction in ways that I felt less and less comfortable with. And so I essentially made the choice of not working for them, preserved my relationship with the school in Switzerland, but made a choice not to work for that school. Not a lot of architects turn down work. I think you're sort of defined not by what you say yes to, but why you say no to. And I do think there are times, as an architect, if you have integrity, you have to sometimes say no. This is what the campus looks like around that green. For the master plan, we did a detail area around that green space and the courtyard in front of Coach House. And this was for what they call the outline plan, for the approval of the outline plan. But we not only approved a plan, but also the design of the buildings. And again, it was the quality of the architecture that actually got us the approval for this project. I did a series of renderings of each of these spaces. That's what the courtyard in front of the Coach House there on the left was designed to look like, and that's what it actually looks like today. A parent of one of the students who was from Syria actually donated the fountain there, which is all made of Syrian marble. And the hedges need to grow, but otherwise it essentially looks like the watercolor. And then on the green, I did that view looking back towards the upper school building on the left and what we called Oak Court on the right. The Oak Court was a building that essentially was again, truly plugged in the gap between a series of existing buildings, but also needed to allow circulation into the larger green on the backside of that arcade. And so it had to have an arcade itself. And one of the advantages of the director of the school in England was he had a penchant for old buildings and renovating old buildings. And he actually bought some incredible old timbers that were essentially demolished from a building at Durham Cathedral. And so he had these incredible timber brackets, 13th century timber, 14th century timber brackets. And so that building actually I designed to incorporate those timber brackets and essentially made an arcade out of them. You can see there in the photograph on the left, it essentially took the timber brackets, which had supported some sort of bracketing structure up above, and I made them essentially mirror them and made them into an arcade. And then the upper school building on the left is a more ostensibly classical building, but essentially it looks like the renderings. Switzerland, though, is where my attention has been for, again, about 29 years. And I'm calling this an illegal academic village because, you know, each location has its challenges. England was flat. We were in the London Greenbelt. We were working with planners who made judgments about how much we can build. There were no guidelines about floor area ratio to amount of land. It was all based on what seemed to be appropriate to the planners. Switzerland, being Switzerland, it's all mathematics. It's all calculated, essentially. We have a certain amount of land. We can build 25% building coverage as footprint, and we can build 55% floor area with respect to the amount of land we have. And so my intention was to build essentially as compact a village environment as we could on the hillside. That's the other challenge of Switzerland. It's on a hillside, spectacular views of Lake Lugano, but essentially, we had a certain amount of building that we could build, and the school wanted to essentially max out the development potential because they had built a lot of rather shabby temporary structures that were all in one state or another of falling down, and they wanted to build permanent buildings. The most important of those was the gymnasium, the Palestra, the big yellow building there, replaced a leaning building they called the Bubble, which was essentially a kind of inflatable, almost inflatable bubble-like building that was the gym for about 30 years, but it was in danger of falling down. And so we needed to build better quality facilities that they didn't have. And so they were going to max out the building potential, but we wanted to preserve the maximum amount of open green space as possible because it's precious and there's not a lot of it, and there's not a lot of flat green space that the students could actually use. So we were encouraged to build on the hillside, and I wanted the school to build as compact, essentially a village environment as possible. We did everything right, except for one thing. The buildings were all too close together. So the whole area is zoned for a kind of suburban development. Every new building is supposed to be 8 meters apart from every other building, so about 25 feet. The gymnasium was the only building that existed on the site that you see there. Was a building the school had built in the 1980s, that kind of pinkish building with the 3 arcade bays in the middle. That building was kind of floated there at the bottom of the hillside. The way we got around the planning restrictions was essentially that entire hillside is an addition to that building of Monticello. Every one of the buildings on the hillside is connected to that building in one way or another, underground by arcades or wings that extend the building. So essentially the entire building, which looks like a collection of individual buildings, is nominally by the planning restrictions, essentially an addition onto that building built in the 1980s. That was because what we should have been able to do, we could not do legally by planning restrictions that were arbitrarily imposed. There's nothing inherently right about those planning restrictions. They're basically meant to preserve a certain amount of buffer space between the buildings. But if you're thinking about essentially developing a lot of the hillside, and that hillside has developed, it's called the Colino d'Oro, the Hill of Gold, because it's actually become incredibly prestigious land, partly because the school's there. And so the super high value, it's been built out to the maximum, but it's mostly been built out on a suburban model. And we have built on a different kind of model, and we've been able to preserve much more open green space that's both usable and preserves more of the aspect of that hillside that it had historically. But we had to do that by getting around the planning restrictions by essentially a kind of a trick, which unfortunately they saw through, but eventually couldn't stop us until they rewrote the laws a couple of years ago. And now we can't do that anymore because they just don't like us very much. I am this part of Ticino in general, but this area around Lugano is the closest thing to an architectocracy I've ever encountered. Architects have huge political power and authority there, and they have essentially imposed an aesthetic on the environment. It's both a planning aesthetic, but an architectural one as well. And we are very much contrary to that. And while they can't stop us, they make it as hard as possible. And it's actually gotten harder over 29 years. It's actually harder than it was when I started. This is the first iteration of the master plan, designed in 1996, the rendering done in 1997. Analytique on the left. I'm a big advocate and proponent, practitioner of the analytique as a compositional type, but I also do them for clients. I mean, this one's essentially an image that the school used to promote the campus for years. And then the view on the right there shows what the campus was meant to look like from essentially the southeastern edge just outside of the campus. The campus was smaller than it is today, essentially adjacent to the gym, which is, I think, labeled as is that number one in the plan? Yeah, number one on the plan, the big building with the apsidal ends. That's the gymnasium. The land immediately to the right of that, the school did not own until almost 10 years later. And so we had to plan the campus with the configuration of the land that they actually had, with no idea about how the campus would grow, but it did grow. And so this is a revised version of the master plan, which is not exactly what we're building today, but closer. At least the land configuration is the same. And so I've had to evolve. The campus plan has changed. I mean, the concept has not changed. The idea of a village, basically compacting the buildings, building as many buildings as contiguous to each other as possible and preserving as much open space as possible, that has not changed. The configuration of the plan has changed because the land has changed, because the school's needs have changed. And so I've had to be flexible about adapting and revising the master plan, even as planning regulations change, and preserving the core idea. And I think that's an essential lesson that you shouldn't, especially working for a client with evolving needs. I think you have to decide what is it that you're doing for them that is essential and how much of it can be modified or negotiated. And so the core concept has remained, but the form of it has changed over time. I've also done a lot of designs for buildings that did not get built at TASIS. These are just some of the more recent ones. All of these are renderings for buildings that are not being built as they're drawn and designed here. It's gotten me a little burned out on making watercolors. I've made a lot of watercolors that get filed away. But essentially, the watercolors have a lot of value because, the thing about making drawings or images like this is that this is all there is to go on until the building gets built. And many of these buildings are going to be fundraised for. So the only thing the school can fundraise with is the image of what we're trying to build. And so they have value. And my client's great credit, she still likes hand-drawn drawings. And so I still do them. I'll show you one soon that's coming up that is not in the exhibition because I just did it 2 weeks ago. So this is built out over time. The school didn't have all the money, didn't have the opportunity to build the whole campus master plan at one time. It was built out over several, obviously 29 years now. The first phases around that building, that sort of pinkish building with the arcades in the middle, which Mrs. Fleming had called Monticello. The first buildings around that were first the gym. That was the thing that conditioned the whole plan. It was the biggest building. It could only fit one way, which was plugged into the hillside. which means it was a bit counterintuitive. If you thought about the configuration of that land, you would turn the gym 90 degrees and run it parallel to the contours, but it couldn't fit, so we had to insert it into the hillside. That raised the gym floor up 1 floor from ground level. We packed changing rooms down below in the ground floor level. There's a dance studio and there's some other public spaces down there. So the gym is 1 story up. And then the next major building that we built was the library, which is tacked onto the other side of Monticello. And while the gym has a regular footprint, which you can see here on the right, inserted into the hillside, the library was really a kind of a poche building that had to deal with the funny configuration of the land and making the most out of that configuration of the property as possible. This is what the interior of the gym looks like. And the gym, I will tell you, is based on a very esoteric idea, which is that for me, it's important that buildings, especially public buildings, have meaning, that they transcend their mundane uses and they talk about something bigger than simply what goes on there. And the old idea of a gymnasium was in the Greek world was a place of the formation of the whole person, mind, body, and soul. So the gymnasia were places where you essentially worked on yourself, not just your body. And the Roman idea for that, the Roman equivalent for that was the palestra at a Roman bath. The palestra at a Roman bath was essentially a place where poetry readings and philosophical discussions would happen, generally at like the baths of Caracalla, in apsidal spaces outside the bath building proper on either side of the large garden behind the bath. In the 16th century, Piero Ligorio, who's a great antiquarian architect of the 16th century, who designed the Villa d'Este in Tivoli, among other things, he designed the courtyard of the Sapienza University in Rome. And when he designed the courtyard, he designed it to look like what he thought an ancient Greek gymnasium looked like. But he didn't know what an ancient Greek gymnasium looked like, but he thought it looked like the palestra of a Roman bath. And a palestra is the Italian word for gymnasium. So Piero Ligorio's mistaken idea of what a Renaissance mistaken idea of what an ancient Greek gymnasium looked like is where the footprint or the plan of this building comes from. Now, that's an esoteric idea, but it also had practical consequences, or I think value. One of which is that it actually, because the gym was pinched in on its, short dimension, and it was also supposed to function as the public meeting hall, the meeting hall for the whole school. So it has bleacher space when the court is in function that only seats about 120 people. But they wanted to have all school meetings there and seat up to 400, 500 people. So the bleachers pull out onto the basketball court. But otherwise, we were really pinched in on that cross dimension. The long dimension in a basketball court is where you need more space outside the bounds of the court, because the players are generally running the long dimension, not across the short dimension. So it gave the players more space behind the baskets. The other thing it did is it provided a lower apsidal volume towards essentially the campus side. So this big looming building kind of ratchets its scale down and becomes also a little softer because it's rounded. So my esoteric idea was also practical. I mean, it had a practical intention. But I did this analytique sort of plan of the thing to show what it actually where its source was. There's the plan of the Sapienza. That's where Borromini's great San Ivo actually is. Borromini's from Ticino. Some of the molding profiles in the building have a Borrominian character, but that's the original plan of what the Sapienza courtyard was supposed to be like, which it has apses at both ends. It currently only has the apse at the end towards San Ivo. And down below, you see these guys wrestling. So I paint frescoes, and not a lot of people hire me to paint frescoes, so I hire myself. And so I gave this building a fresco program. And one of the fresco programs was on the front facade, on that apsidal front. It has a series of 6 medallions that represent a kind of a mythical idea of a transformation from wrestling as a sport to dance. And so there's a kind of a sequence an imaginary sequence that I developed of a series of these medallions that start with the figure of 2 wrestlers. And the wrestlers are Ajax and Odysseus from the Iliad, where there's a wrestling match that takes place in front of the walls of Troy. And Homer says that the 2 wrestlers, belted tight, stepped into the ring, their arms locked together like rafters a master builder builds, slanting into a pitched roof to fight the ripping winds. So he says a roof truss is like two wrestlers pushing against each other. And that's actually what's going on in a truss. It's you want to create those compressive forces. They're essentially the bottom cord of the truss is sort of pulling in, but otherwise the roof truss is like these two guys pushing against each other. So that's the first scene. And they're shown in front of a kind of primitive hut structure. And that has something to do with the roof trusses inside. The three graces are the last of the sequence. They're dancing in front of an Ionic temple, and the pediment on the outside of the building is actually Ionic. So the building is Doric and rustic and wrestling-like and robust on the inside, and graceful and delicate and Ionic on the outside. And all of that's to say that's a gymnasium. And these days, we tend to think of gymnasiums like body shops, like a place like you would go to get your car fixed, except it's for a person. They have an industrial kind of aesthetic that's more about the body as a kind of almost a mechanism. And this is really meant to be a cultural building. It's where sport goes on, but it's also part of a larger cultural program for the school. And so eventually after that, the library is down there at the end. The library won a Palladio Award from traditional building, and then there's the gym. And then to the right of that, the school acquired the land, that little spike of land to the right of the gym, and that's where we built a theater that was originally going to be across the road, underground, but we were able to build an above-ground theater building, proper theater building. The library interior is on the left. The library interior, I mean, one of the ways I thought about the library was that it unfolds like the reading of a book. So the library, it doesn't sort of reveal itself from the outside. You discover it, or it unfolds inside as a series of revealed spaces. It opens onto a cross-axis, which does not seem to exist from the outside. And on the main axis, it actually develops into this double height space, which opens up into an upper reading room. And so that idea that the spaces kind of unfold as a novel might unfold is a poetic idea behind the structure of the library. Instead, the theater was supposed to be essentially a black box theater. So it's basically a barn. I mean, the theater space proper is a barn. And this is something I learned working in Mark's office. We had to have a control booth because they actually do, project. It's not just a theater performance space. They also do lectures in there, and they needed they also wanted to control the lighting system and the sound system. And because it was so small, we couldn't sacrifice any of and we couldn't create any kind of poche space between the lobby here. This is the upstairs lobby and the theater proper. We didn't want to sacrifice any of the seating, which was at the minimum that they required. And we couldn't create a kind of a poche zone for the control booth. So I essentially created this fiction of the control booth like a pavilion within the upstairs lobby, which is something that we did for a bathroom in somebody's apartment, I think in New York once upon a time. But it's treated like a theatrical kind of folly in a certain way. And it's actually based on something, if anybody knows, there's a famous 18th century country house castle essentially outside of Stockholm called Drottningholm, or that means the Queen's Palace. And there's a great 18th century theater there, but there's also this famous Turkish tent, which is a kind of a folly in the garden. So this is a kind of a Turkish tent folly that's also the control booth. So you go in there and you work the lights and stuff. Above all that, so when you saw that photograph earlier, there were just trees up the hillside. Above all that were these buildings at the top of the hill. The little one I called Fiammetta, the big one Lanterna, because these are one of the four symbols on the Tassis crest. So one of the four symbols on the Tassis crest is a lantern. And so I decided this building needed a lantern. And I called the building La Lanterna, so that the school would build that lantern on the top, which I knew they would obviously get value engineered out of there if the building wasn't named after it. And then because the lantern, at least in the old school crest, was actually an old oil lamp and had a little flame coming out of it, we were able to insert this little building in between the gym, which is just kind of in front of us here, and the lantern up above. I called it Fiammetta, the little flame. That's why it's red. So it's the little flame that would be coming out of the lantern. But essentially, that little building does a big job of essentially creating a more urban sequence of spaces between the two buildings rather than just kind of the interstitial sloping hillside. One of the advantages of working on the hillside also is that we get stairs, public stairs, outdoor stairs, retaining walls and terraces that also define space. So the lower wall, retaining wall with the stairs and all that also does a good job of defining space as well. And the building at the top of the hill follows the road at the top of the hill, set it parallel to the contours, and it bends around the road. And up the hill from there, there's a building in the little village of Montagnola called Casa Camuzzi, which is actually designed by an architect from that area who went to work in Russia. So a lot of Ticinese architects. Ticino used to be famous for architects. So Domenico Fontana, who was Sixtus V's architect, was from there. Carlo Maderno, who does the nave and facade of St. Peter's. Borromini, his nephew. Carlo Fontana, who was the academic director of the Accademia di San Luca in Rome, early 18th century, all from Ticino. By the late 18th century, there was no more work in Rome, so a lot of architects from Ticino went to work in Russia, worked in St. Petersburg, and did a number of buildings in Russia. And this guy went to Russia, came back, made a lot of money, came back and designed a house for himself. And it has this arched passage with a stair that descends down to a garden, but that one actually pinches down because of the configuration of the land. Because of our configuration, I did the same motif essentially, but it actually opens up to the view because this is meant to function as a gateway to the from the upper part of the campus. There's a road behind this building. You descend down that stairway, the view opens up down, you see Lake Lugano and the Alps in the distance. But I thought the school would never build that building. I just thought it's too good. It's too amazing. This has got to be really hard. And so in the gym, I did this fresco. There's a loggia at the top of the gym on the back side at the top of a flight of outdoor stairs. And it has a fresco painting of the choice of Hercules. And if anybody knows the story, it's not really part of the core myth. It's really an allegory, ancient though, about Hercules. And it's the idea that Hercules makes his club from a big oak tree, or I'm sorry, olive tree. And then he sits down to rest. And he's visited by two women who represent two life choices, virtue and vice. But vice is not a dissolute life, a life of, basically squandering everything and, being a bad guy. But she offers him a life of ease in a shady grove. Virtue points him towards the hard, rocky uphill path to fame. And of course, being a hero, he chooses the hard, rocky uphill path to fame. I showed Virtue holding a trowel with an unfinished building behind her, and she's pointing uphill so she's basically saying to the school, the virtuous thing to do is to keep going and build all that stuff up on the hill. And they actually did. They were flush with money at one point. But so one of the things I've done is I've decided it's important to me that these buildings mean something beyond satisfying their programmatic needs and being functionally and useful and being attractive. I think it's important that they actually have something to say about the life, the values, the ethos of the school. And so now the headmaster loves talking about this thing. He uses it in an ethics course he teaches. And the theater also has an iconographic program. It talks about the nature of the building. There's an elegant bit. There are different things that go on in the theater, and I juxtaposed two, in this particular case, tragedy and comedy. There's also history and music that also go on in that theater. And the theater is a juxtaposition of the rustic theater space and the elegant lobbies. But it's harder to do that. It's harder to make buildings meaningful. For me, it actually helps solve one of the problems that I was introduced into school, which is the arbitrariness of form. And how do you stop your formal preferences from just being things that you like? And for me, it's essential that the form actually has some capacity to convey some kind of meaning about the nature and the importance of the buildings that I'm actually designing. But it's harder. So this is what happened up the hill. That's the La Lanterna building at the top, Fiammetta there. Eventually, then we built behind the theater an arts building. That's partly because the theater is an arts function. There's an art studio space here. They actually teach architectural design, pottery, a variety of artistic studio spaces. So that's a studio building. And then there's the science building down here. The last thing we built until what's under construction now. The science building actually looks out to a sports field. And out in the exhibition, you'll see that there's an ionic column from the facade of the Science Building. That ionic column is actually from a very specific source. It's actually the ionic order from the Colosseum. And so the way I justified it was that the Science Building looks onto the sports field. So I chose the ionic order from the Colosseum because even though it's a kind of inside-out thing, it's the ionic order of a sports facility, essentially in ancient Rome. In the pediment of the Arts Building is a cartouche. It partly alludes to the donor. They had a major donor for this building who was one of their graduates who was Turkish. And so there are a number of allusions there to Turkish culture, but it also has this Tacitus crest. And one of the images in the Tacitus crest is a book, and the book is open. And in that book, I actually wrote this quote, so this is if you're interested in classical culture and architecture and art, both of these quotes should be familiar to you. Nulla dia sine lineas in that book, open in that book, it's attributed to Apelles. It means never a day without a line. So that if you're actually somebody involved in a creative discipline, an artistic, visual art discipline, arts, fine arts, architecture, you should never go through a day without making one kind of drawing. Make something every day. So that's a motto. The other one is from a medieval consultant to Milan Cathedral who said, art without science is nothing. And these two buildings are actually linked. All those terraces are actually part of the Science Building. Science and art here are actually connected. What it really means is that arts in the old classical sense have to do with knowledge that have aspects of judgment, essentially things that involve judgment. Scientia or science has to do with knowledge, hard knowledge, things that can be absolutely known. And so this consultant to the Milan Cathedral was essentially saying, you have to have knowledge about what you're trying to do aesthetically. It's not enough that you want to do something because it's attractive. You need rigor and principles. And by that, he meant proportions, mathematics that should inform the proportions and the geometry of Milan Cathedral. So art without science is nothing. So this is the view up there. That's the gym, the top of the gym. That's the loggia where the Choice of Hercules is. That's the dormitory Lanterna building. There's little Fiammetta. And a lot of what this is about is that's a dormitory that has these incredible, spectacular views. So it's a single loaded corridor, rooms looking out to the valley. And so a lot of this is about, taking advantage of that incredible position on the hillside. And in many ways, you could think of it as kind of framing the view. And in fact, the view down that stairway, that arch passage, is this spectacular view out over the campus, out to the lake and the mountains in the distance. And that was partly generated by the geometry of the site, partly by taking advantage of the fact that you wanted to connect the upper and lower bit of the school. I was saying to Mark earlier, by the way, this entire hillside is disabled accessible. Every building on the hillside has an elevator. You can get from one building to the next by climbing to the top in the elevator, getting over to the next building, so you can work your way all the way up the hillside. It's about an 80-foot change in grade. But one of the things that's come to me over the course of doing this building, and about which my client is very sympathetic, is that a lot of buildings in Ticino take advantage of the view. Not all of them contribute to the view. And so the motto I've come up with for the school is be the view you want to see. If you really want to look out at a great landscape, you have some responsibility to add to that landscape so that somebody would want to look at you. Because when Tacitus is looking out over the valley to the hill in the distance, they're looking at another village across the way. And somebody in that village is looking back at them. And the idea is that you have a responsibility not to just take advantage of your situation on a site, but to actually contribute to it in some way or another. So this is the drawing, the new drawing that's not in the exhibition because I just did this a couple of weeks ago. And it's a kind of capriccio fantasy of all the new buildings and upcoming buildings for Tacitus, all the parts that haven't yet been built or are under construction right now. So the stuff in the back, top in the far back, is the stuff that's under construction now. Second half of my talk now, though, is about, how are we doing? What kind of architect do you want to be? So I'm going to fly through the rest of this stuff because I probably said too much about that. But I think it's more interesting in a certain way to hear about the struggles of getting something built. But when you ask yourself what kind of architect do you want to be, the question is really, how good do you want to be? In the sense of how do you measure yourself? And with respect to somebody who's interested in the classical tradition, whether you want to be or not, you will be measured against what people have done before you. And I'm going to leave you at the very end of this with a problem question that has to do with that idea. So the fantastical projects are the projects that have to do with both my aspirations as an architect and also my formation of myself as an architect by pursuing my aspirations, by pushing myself to do things that are more than what I think the world will let me do. It's at least recalibrated my sense of what I'm capable of and therefore what is possible in the world. We start off that way as architects by learning from what people have done before. The way we learn as architects is by drawing on site. I draw on site, I paint on site, I paint in watercolor, I paint in oil. On the right, by the way, of course, you know the left, on the right is the library in Venice by Sansovino. And it's actually part of a study of that corner condition that I actually just presented at the Renaissance Society of America in March. So it's important to know that we're not starting from zero and that our job is to figure out how to learn from that stuff. And the way we learn from the past is by drawing. But also lately, when I've been drawing on site, I've been thinking more and more in terms of building on my historical knowledge, because most of what I know about classical architecture, I know from reading historians, knowing historians personally and reading historians. And knowing that makes me realize how complicated the history of architecture is and what are the missing bits or the things that condition our impression of buildings that may not be what the architect originally intended. Hopefully you recognize the building on the right, but you might not recognize it in that particular form. That's Palladio's Loggia del Capitaniato, which faces the Basilica in Vicenza. It has 3 bays. Most historians are convinced that it was meant to have at least 5 bays, if not even 7 bays. I was sketching it on site and I thought, you know, I should draw it as a 5-bay building. It doesn't have 5 bays, but I can draw 5 bays because I can look at it and just add another couple. And it changes your perception of that building. It becomes not a vertical building, but essentially a more horizontally disposed one. But that's imagination. That's not just, I mean, I don't want to say just drawing on site, but I mean, drawing on site as architects, we can also change things, correct things, imagine things that aren't necessarily there. On the left, you might not recognize this, but this is Brunelleschi's Santo Spirito in Florence. And I was sitting on a bench in the side aisle here, looking back towards the front door. And you may or may not know about Brunelleschi's church. He designed it 2 years before he died. It was finished after his death. And it has this incredible system, really metrical system of arcaded side aisles. And the module for the central nave is essentially 2 arcade bays as a square. So essentially, every 2 arcaded side aisle bays become essentially 1 square bay of the module or the proportional system of the nave. And that system wraps into the transept and into the choir behind the crossing. And because it's 2 bays, it means that every transept end and behind the altar, you have a column in the middle. As the system gets around towards the front door, that was the last bit they built because, you know, historically churches were built from the back towards the front. The last bit that they built was towards the front facade. And there should have been a column in the middle, which does not exist today, which is why the nave is actually 9 bays long, and it was probably meant to be 8 bays with an arcaded bay that wrapped across the inside facade of the front facade of the building. So I was sitting there and I said, well, I should draw it the way it would have been if that actually happened. So I actually drew the column. That means there's a central door, which you couldn't have anymore, which means you had to have 2 doors. So I drew 2 doors. They're behind the, or underneath the arcades, and you can see they have kind of thermal windows up above. So I drew this as if Brunelleschi's project had been realized. And I can do that because I'm an architect, because I think like an architect. I'm interested in what Brunelleschi was thinking, but I'm also interested in maybe doing what he would have liked to have done, but his client probably thought was too weird and decided not to do. That's our great capacity as architects, as opposed to an historian, is that we can imagine what doesn't exist. This is when I was on the Gabriel Prize in Paris. I was looking at the work of Charles Lebrun. Lebrun was Louis XIV's director of the arts, which means he oversaw not only painting projects, but the design of tapestries of the Gobelins factory. And he was also an architect. He designed one little thing, which is a pavilion at the Chateau of Sceaux. But he also may have designed the church of Saint Nicolas de Chardonnay, where his mother is buried. And so not only did I document the column capitals of the nave of San Nicolas, I actually designed a allegorical tomb for Charles Le Brun as if he were buried in San Nicolas next to his mother. And it's a kind of compendium of references to art and architecture of his time under Louis XIV. And so, you know, the reason we study the past as architects is to help us understand how to build the present better. I mean, from an architectural point of view, historical knowledge is esoteric if we don't put it to any particular use. And so that's one way of putting it to use, is imagining something like that. The other thing I've done, this is just recent, and this is more for fun than anything. And the faded background image, this is a drawing by a guy named Leeuwenkrooijl, who was a Dutch artist who worked in Rome in the 17th century, who did a series of drawings of Rome backwards because they were all meant to be the drawings for engravings. And if you know about engraving, the drawing on the engraved plate has to be backwards so the plate is printed correctly. So he went around and did a whole series of drawings of Rome backwards. And Joseph Connors, who's one of the great Borromini scholars, director of the American Academy when I was there, and recently a visiting professor at Notre Dame, was retiring this year definitively. And there was going to be a kind of a festschrift for him, celebration of his career. And so I was asked to do the drawing for the poster. And so I actually, and because Joe's probably the greatest living Borromini scholar, I did this drawing that's based on the style of a Leeuwenkrooijl drawing, but composed of all of Borromini's buildings and referencing a whole series of articles that Joe had written. And it actually is inverted and of the image of the frontispiece of Borromini's treatise. So this is the frontispiece of Borromini's treatise, essentially mirrored it and transformed everything, again, under the influence of Joe's scholarship, which has been very important to me. But some of my own scholarship I've done is when I was on the Prince of Wales program in the summer of 2007, I met a wood joiner who was knowledgeable about medieval building techniques, timber framing, and he was really into the daisy wheel, which is a way of generating equilateral triangles by starting with a circle, taking the center, taking the arc of the circle, taking the compass, and putting the center point of the compass anywhere in the diameter of the circle, striking an arc wherever it intersects the circle is the point of an equilateral triangle, which is a geometric way of creating a regular figure, which was the proportional system of medieval buildings, ad triangulum, as opposed to the ancient system, ad quadratum, which is also the Renaissance system. Borromini famously trained at Milan Cathedral, which was actually proportioned according to that guy who said, art without science is nothing, proportioned based on equilateral triangles. And so I thought, well, you know, if Borromini's using triangles as a generative geometry for his projects, what would happen if I took a Vitruvian man and overlaid it on an ad quadratum or ad triangulum system? And I thought some interesting things emerged. Like, for example, like the midpoint of the palm actually winds up, and this is not I didn't stretch the arms. These are basically Vitruvian proportions. The midpoint of the palm winds up at one of the points of the equilateral triangle. When your arms are down at the 30-degree or 60-degree angle of the triangle, you actually touch the intersecting point of the two overlaid equilateral triangles, and the arms hung down like this actually fit just within the smaller equilateral triangle that fits within the other overlaid equilateral triangles. This is imagination at work. This is what we do as architects that sometimes historians are a little afraid to do. So the idea of my birthday last year was that I was going to go to this thing in Genazzano, out southeast of Rome, designed maybe by Bramante. Mostly people think it's by Bramante. It's called a nymphaeum. We really don't know if it was a nymphaeum, but amazing structure that Palladio certainly knew, because you see those oculi around the spandrels of the arch there. Palladio uses them at the Villa Pojana. This has to be his source, although Brunelleschi does similar things elsewhere, like Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. But Palladio knew this building. People knew this building in the 16th century. It's sort of it was never finished. It's a ruin. It's a Renaissance ruin. I went there to do some paintings and some drawings, but the more I thought about it, the thought, you know, what would this thing have been like if it was actually completed? And there are some reconstructions. I don't find them convincing. Christoph Leopold Frommel, who's a great German Renaissance scholar, did one, but I find it very schematic. There are some new ones. that I don't think that get the classical orders right. And so I did a reconstruction of what it might have looked like, but I had to use a lot of imagination because not only do not the column capitals exist of the order on the facade, therefore we also don't know how tall the columns are supposed to be, how tall the entablature is, whether it had a roof on it or not. But it probably was also meant to be stuccoed and frescoed inside, and almost no evidence of that exists apart from a little bit of stucco shell niches. So I did a fully imaginative reconstruction. The thing is, there's no archival evidence for any of this. I mean, everything other than that ruin is all we have on this building. There are no drawings in archives that exist that we can look to say that, well, this is what Bramante or maybe Peruzzi intended. So I had to imagine it. I personally describe this a little bit like a performer of early music who has no idea what 17th century music actually sounded like because they didn't live in the 17th century. But from what they know about how the music was described, they take their best guess at what it might have been like. And so this is my best guess. It's not necessarily what it was actually like, but I think it gets us a little farther to understanding why it is the way it is today, as the ruin it actually is. What was that ruin meant to be originally? This is the thing that's going to be published, coming out within a month or so, of Memoirs of the American Academy in Rome, which will be available online. When I went to the American Academy in Rome, I was visited before I went because I was the first classical architect to go there, apart from Thomas Gordon Smith, in decades. And Henry Hope Reed came to my apartment in Philadelphia and tried to convince me to do measured drawings in Rome. And I said, thank you very much, but you know what? The way I have learned to be an architect is by doing designs, by designing stuff. I'm one of those classical architects who does not believe in doing measured drawings. And there are two kinds of classical architects, the kinds that do measured drawings and the kind that don't. Michelangelo did not do measured drawings of buildings, and neither did Bernini. But what I do is design and test myself against historical buildings. And so my understanding of what my relationship to history is that I see myself in an emulative role, a word that CJ used in the introduction. And I'm going to come to emulation at the end of the talk, and we're almost there. Emulation means trying to do what somebody did, but trying to do it not just as well, not copying something, but trying to do it maybe better. It's actually a kind of rivalry with your sources. And it's the way of pushing yourself to try to measure up to the past. And I have an important quote about that at the end. I've also done things like, those are all things that no one asked me to do. There were fantasy projects. No one asked me to do this either. When I got tenure at Notre Dame, I did this design for a chapel on the Notre Dame campus that has garnered virtually no interest from anybody in building, but I think it's kind of a needed thing at the end of the South Quad. If you know the Notre Dame campus, the South Quad kind of runs out of gas in front of O'Shaughnessy Hall, the building about which Frank Lloyd Wright apparently said, plant fast-growing ivy and pray for rain. And Notre Dame, amazingly dedicated to the Virgin, does not have a chapel dedicated to Mary on campus, or a building dedicated to Mary on campus. So I decided to solve that problem. There it is. In Rome, when I was at the American Academy, I did a project to fill in the Via della Conciliazione, the street that leads to St. Peter's that was created by demolitions in the 1920s and early 1930s under Mussolini, when essentially Rome was separated from Vatican City. And I did a project to fill it back in and create a proper sequence and a gateway to the Piazza of St. Peter's. I think, and I'm sure this is maybe partly true here. At Notre Dame, there's a lot of confusion, I think, about why we send students to Rome. And if you ask most of my colleagues, you'd get a series of different answers to that question. My answer to that question is, why do you go to Rome? You go to Rome to confront excellence. That means you go to Rome to deal with operating in an excellent environment where you have to try to measure up to that environment and get to that level as close as possible. That means I'm not a particular fan of doing projects out in the periphery or out in the modern neighborhoods of Rome. I think you need to work within the historic center of Rome and right hard up against Bramante and, San Gallo and Michelangelo and Bernini and Borromini, and deal with trying to measure up. And I think that's how I see the operation of an architect designing stuff in Rome, is trying to come up to that level. So I did that project. Later on, I did another project after that to follow on to that. I dealt with the area around the Lateran. I didn't develop it quite as much, but the Lateran's also a bit of a urbanistic, for me at least, an urbanistic disaster. And then more recently, I did this Academy for Raphael Studies for the 500th anniversary of Raphael's death, the anniversary in 2020. And that was an infill project based kind of on a Palazzo Raphael designed for himself in the Via Giulia that was never built. Last project I'm going to show you is, this one's done on the computer, and it's not necessarily there's a cause and effect relationship there. But my wife, for a number of years in Rome, was working for the Jesuit Refugee Services. And in 2017, Rome had a couple of crises about housing people. One was the refugee influx. The other one was there had just been a major earthquake in Abruzzo, but there had been a lot of damaged buildings and a lot of people left homeless. And at the same time, I was actually teaching an urbanism course, and I was interested in the hospitals of Rome. So Noli, in his Noli map, shows the insides of a number of buildings. He shows churches, he shows palaces, he shows theaters, and he shows hospitals. And historically, hospitals were basically big halls, what they call a ward-type hospital. So a big room with lots of beds in it, high windows for ventilation and light. And there are interesting urban elements. And there's one in this map here, the plan. There's a long bar building up there. You can see that's the Hospital of San Gallicano in Trastevere. I thought that typology would make an interesting way of providing temporary housing for people. So a permanent building to provide temporary housing for displaced people. Could be displaced by environmental disasters like an earthquake. It could be for refugees who are temporarily housed in the city before they're integrated into society. And it also solved two problems at the same time, because I saw these buildings as actually infill buildings that could be inserted into the over-wide boulevards of 19th century Rome, which really fragmented the city. So Viale Trastevere in Trastevere really split Trastevere in half. And I figured you could actually put one of these buildings in there with basically dining hall there and on the main floor, dormitory space up above, kitchens down below. You can insert that into Viale Trastevere and keep all of the circulation functions that are currently there. Sidewalks on all sides of the buildings, a parking lane, a traffic lane, a tram line on both sides of the building, and a bike lane in the width of a street that currently has all those functions today. And this was kind of killing two birds with one stone, but it was a way of using my study of the past to deal with and solve, again, problem no one asked me to solve, of a modern problem in the city of Rome. So this is what the cover of the second book I wrote on emulation. Emulation is a classical part of the formation of people originally in the classical and the ancient world, of people in the literary world, essentially learning how to write. You first learn by imitating other authors, then you try to emulate, which means rivaling them. Longinus, in his treatise on the Sublime, says, he says it's like going into battle with somebody. And he said, you might break a lance. You might break your lance going up against somebody else with their lance who's more able than you. He said, but this strife is good for mortals. It strengthens us. We test ourselves against the best, and it actually makes us better. Emulation is a missing part of the formation of architects. I think one of the problems of the classical movement, especially today, is that I wouldn't say a respect for the past. There's a reverence for the past, where the past is thought of as being so great, so incredible, that the best we can do is at best copy it or do some version of it, rather than thinking we can measure up to it or even go past it. But the reality is, historically, everybody tried to surpass their predecessors. Seneca said, I don't want to follow in somebody else's footsteps. I want to follow their path. He said, but the people who've come before us are not our masters, but our guides. Petrarch says in the 14th century almost exactly the same thing. He says, I want to get to the same place, and I might even follow the same road, but I'm not going to walk in somebody else's footsteps. Michelangelo said, if you follow in somebody else's footsteps, you never surpass them. And Borromini said, I did not come into this profession to be an imitator of somebody else. that is an essential part of what constituted classical culture since antiquity. And I think we've lost sight of it because we're so intimidated by the past. We think we might just kind of come close. What about thinking about measuring up or even trying to go beyond it? Because the reality is, in life, there's a gravitational pull downwards. Like if anybody's ever shot an arrow, you know that you have to aim higher than the target because gravity is going to pull that arrow down across its trajectory. The trajectory of life out there in the world, there are lots of gravitational pulls on architecture out there in the world today. There are your clients. There are your collaborating architects and engineers and planning regulations and building codes and construction systems and requirements for all kinds of things from insulation to waterproofing that are challenges to building the best possible buildings. They don't make it impossible, but it's gotten harder. And the question for us is that an excuse for our work not being as good as the past? So this is the last thing I'm going to say to you is an anecdote. When I presented my project at the American Academy in Rome, 1989, I was 6 years out of school. It was presented to an audience, public audience at the Academy. There were a number of people there. There were David Rosand, if anybody knew who David Rosand was. He was the great scholar of Venetian painting in the Renaissance painting in Venice. Irving Lavin, who, if anybody doesn't, they should know Irving Lavin's writings about Bernini. He was the great Bernini scholar of the second half of the 20th century. And Colin Rowe, who'd been my professor in Rome and somebody I got to know better a little later. And Colin and I did not get along, actually, when I was his student. I'll claim credit for Irving Lavin said to me about my project for the Via della Conciliazione that I had restored the sacred dimension to Bernini's urbanism, which I took a bow for. Colin said, isn't the problem with doing this kind of work is that all you'll ever be is a mediocre version of the past? I said, I mean, I was not intimidated by that question. I said, I don't think there's anything in the air or the water that makes us inferior to the people who've come before us. We might have cultural challenges that get in the way. We may also have to be self-taught, whereas they had teachers. But all we have to do is work harder, try a little harder, or at least aspire to trying harder. If you want to know why Colin said that, I've learned recently, if you go to Judy DeMaio's website called Close Reads and look at Colin Rowe's architectural drawings when he thought he was going to be an architect, I think I know why Colin said that. That was his fear. And I will tell you that it is actually the fear of, I think, many of modern architects, modernist architects, is that it is impossible for us to do classical work as well as it had been done in the past, and better to not do it badly and do something else than to fail at doing it well. So a lot of us are defined by what we aspire to. But I think it's too often true that in the traditional architecture world, we define ourselves by what we're opposed to. And we think we're opposed to modernism. And therefore, as long as you're not modernist, you're okay. You're on the side of the angels if you're not on the side of the devil. I don't think the problem, and I don't think the enemy is modernism. I think the enemy is mediocrity. And I think that is the great challenge of doing what we do today, is trying to be excellent at what we do and not letting the cultural gravitational forces pull us down, but at least aspire to being as good as the past. When I talk about mediocrity, I'm not talking about talent or natural ability. I'm talking about mediocre aspirations, not aspiring to be the best. Because whether you are or not isn't really up to you. I mean, it's going to be beyond your control, and whatever God-given talents you have are not yours. You can only do something with them, but they are what they are. Architecture is mostly about hard work. I mean, there's a certain amount of talent involved in architecture, but the profession is also littered with very talented people who peaked in college and basically never really went on to do very much, because most of what you need to know about being an architect, you learn after you graduate from college. So the question is, what are your aspirations? And I think that is the question every architect has to answer. And I think you should not make the mistake of aspiring too low. Thank you.
Switch this so people can see. Oops. And
Thank you very much, David. Very provocative presentation, which has to have inspired some questions. So, questions.
We're all supposed to move, by the way, into the exhibition hall a little later, which is,
Yeah.
I'm also happy to engage with all of you or any of you in there. But in a public forum, it's sometimes useful for everybody to hear the question and for everybody to hear the answer.
Yeah.
So yes,
Milton.
yeah.
Hi, that was a fabulous talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
I really got a lot out of it personally and as an architect. I just wanted to mention a quote that I've heard from Michelangelo, that the problem is not aiming too high and missing it, but aiming too low and hitting it, which is another way of saying what you said.
Absolutely. That's excellent. Thank you.
Other questions?
Oh, come on.
Come on, students.
Come at me. No, I think sometimes this is actually you feel challenged by this, but in a way that I know you're going to ask questions later, but I think you have to have the courage to ask them in front of everybody. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the talk. That was a really good talk.
Thank you.
I just want to ask I know some people aren't necessarily classicists. Will you define that as a mediocrity, or do you think that they can have a...
No. I think there's excellence is relative to the thing to which you aspire. What I mean by mediocrity has to do with within whatever it is you choose to do, you don't aim at being the best at it. So I meant to say this, but it's a good chance to say it now. Do not believe anybody who says the best is the enemy of the good. That is an Italian political aphorism that Voltaire actually adopted and promoted, and it may have merit in the political world. It has nothing to do with being excellent as an artist or an architect. That essentially the best is how you get to the good, because probably if you aspire to the best, you'll hit the good. If you aspire to the good, you're going to hit the mediocre. And goodness has to do with relative to whatever it is you're trying to do, not some larger good. I mean, you can have another kind of debate about the advantages of classical architecture, but that's not actually what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what you aspire to within the world that you've just engaged with or chosen to pursue.
That's excellent. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk. I have a question, and this is a bit more specific, but I think it's very interesting to study as an architect. In your Switzerland project, you mentioned the views, and you mentioned how it was a really interesting, unique, and just amazing site to work on and have all these buildings. I was wondering, how did you channel the students' flow so that they were constantly being enveloped in the environment? Were there always, or was the focus for flow like outside, exterior hallways, or was it just like, were the students just constantly being approached by these wonderful views of the countryside and forced to see that they're in a really amazing place and to learn from that?
Well, I mean, essentially, because it's a collection of individual buildings, despite the fact that they're all connected, the connection bit is really just a ruse to get around the planning regulations. They are a series of individual buildings with their own doors and access points. And so you have to move between the buildings. I always say this. I personally, again, I'm not making excuses, but I think the buildings at TASIS are pleasant enough, and they're modest buildings. I mean, relative to the rest of the world, Switzerland's expensive, but relative to Switzerland, these are relatively modestly built buildings, humbly built, solidly built, but modestly built. The best part of the campus for me is the spaces between the buildings. That's the argument I always make, and that I think that's the thing that this kind of architecture does well, is create positive open space in between buildings. And it's the nature of the hillside is that isn't necessarily just a street condition, but it means climbing. And when you climb against the contours, that means you're climbing stairs. The advantage of that is once you've climbed those stairs, you can turn around and you get a view. And so that's something that unfolds in section that you would not get on a flat land. So you don't get those kind of views in England, for example. You get a series of experiences of those spaces per se. Those spaces don't open up to anything else because there's no prospect or high point you get to look out from. So it's the advantage of building on a hillside. It's harder to build on a hillside. It's certainly more expensive. They're amazing at doing it in Switzerland with incredibly nimble construction systems. But there are tremendous advantages. And one of them, again, for Switzerland is that the flatland is more precious. I mean, historically, they did farm the hillsides, they terraced the hillsides, but the hillsides were also rocky, so it was not great farmland. The flatland is easier to use for agriculture, it's graze animals, but it's also usable for recreational space. And so for the school, the hillsides were essentially useless. I mean, as open green space. I mean, they're pleasant to look at, but the students can't use them in any productive way. Whereas the flat space can be used as a sports field or as an outdoor assembly space of some kind. And so so there's something to be said for building on the hillside. It's harder. But again, we have not done a lot of that in the States. I mean, I can think of places that build on the hillsides in the States, somewhat. Providence, Rhode Island, a town near where I grew up, Easton, Pennsylvania, has hills, obviously San Francisco, but I'm not sure we've done it well. We've done it almost in spite of the hillside. Whereas taking advantage of the hillside and really making something of it it has spectacular consequences, but it is harder. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. It was great and very inspiring. I had a question whether you believe that there's a harm in going too far into the fantastical. I see in architecture, at least from classical and modern, that it seems to be very divided between the conventional versus the expressionism of it. So I would say, would you say there's a benefit, at least in terms of the design aspect, to try to have a mean between the two extremes of going too far into the expressionism or too far into the convention of what the past has?
I guess that's a decorum question. I mean, essentially, that's how they would have framed it in the classical world. It's how Vitruvius might have framed it as a question of decorum, which is appropriateness. Some things might demand the absolute best and the most fantastical, and not everything does. And I think that's one of the aspects of architectural judgment is your understanding of decorum and what's appropriate in a particular context. There's another kind of appropriateness which has to do with taste, which has to do with, taste. I mean, essentially, which has to do with what you think is appropriate aesthetically, not in terms of its suitability to purpose, but aesthetically not over the top. The Romans, famously said, de gustibus non est disputandum. There's no arguing about taste. I mean, they meant taste in terms of food, but at some level, taste is preference. And you can't really have a rational conversation about what's over the top. Vasari in his Lives of the Artist celebrates a number of people for what he calls novelties. He calls some things bizarrerie, bizarrenesses. He thinks are actually a good thing, like especially Giulio Romano and other people. He actually thinks that adds something to the canon or to the repertoire. It's ultimately culture's job to decide whether you've gone too far or not. I don't know that there's a lot of downside as an architect yourself trying it and maybe realizing you went too far. And I think there's probably an advantage to doing that rather than not trying and not knowing where that upper limit actually is. I mean, because no one's going to be harmed by it. If it's on paper, it's not going to fall down. No one's going to die in the building. You're not going to get sued. So, there's no harm in drawing something over the top. And then you decide, would I ever want this built? And you might say no.
I have a question online. Nicholas Sabogal. Do you want to?
I'll mute him.
Okay. Are you there, Nicholas?
Nicholas. Oh, you're allowed to talk.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you, David, for this presentation. I have the question related to AI. I would like to hear your thoughts on how AI is going to impact or is impacting right now the work that you do. Do you think you can get benefit from it, or it helps the idea of mediocrity? Or yeah, I want to hear that.
Uh, so I've read a quote, I saw this, someone's social media or somewhere, somebody said, I want AI to do my laundry and make my meals, and so I can write poetry and paint paintings. I don't want AI to write poetry and paint paintings, so I have to do my laundry and cook my own meals. I'm not really sure why we want to give up the best part of what it means to be human to a machine. I'm not saying it can't do it. I just don't know why we would give that up. I mean, unless you don't like doing it. And if you don't like doing it, you probably should do something else. So if you like being creative, I don't know really why you'd want a machine to do it for you. And if you think the machine can do it better, I'm not sure in what way it can. I've written a few things. I posted a few things. If anybody's interested, I have a blog on my website. I've written a few things about AI. Its way of operating, I actually think, is a lot like 19th century academic architecture of the École des Beaux-Arts. It's a kind of combinatory process, essentially a kind of assemblage of vast resources of memory, and then arranging and combining things, which is not unlike the classical notion of invention, which depends on memory. But the fundamental difference with artificial intelligence and the human person is the great advantage of artificial intelligence is its infinite memory and its capacity to know everything about everything. But that's also, for me, it's Achilles' heel, because for the thing about us is we can't, I mean, even if you have friends who have phenomenal, I know people who have photographic memories, and I know people who know all kinds of stuff, and Colin Rowe had a phenomenal memory. But even the person with the most incredible memory is ultimately limited in how much they actually know. And the thing about our memories is, if you really want to form them towards being creative, you actually have to make some choices about what you want to remember and what you're going to throw away and forget. And so our memories are selective. I mean, sometimes they're randomly selective. It's just the things we've happened to encounter over the course of our life. But I think if you're really serious about learning and being better at what you do, you make choices about what you read, you make choices about what kind of buildings you look at, you make choices about what kind of buildings you draw, you make choices about where you go on vacation. And all those things contribute to the formation of your memory, not some infinite memory, but your memory. And that memory is yours. It is deliberate. It's based on choices, and it will yield results proper to you that are meaningful, and hopefully meaningful in a wider context, because they will resonate with other people who share your convictions and your judgment and your culture. Artificial intelligence has no culture. It has no personality, it has no experience. It doesn't have friendships. It doesn't experience pain. And so it really can't, it's basically a mimicry of what we do. And it's really good at it. But I don't really know why we would want to let it do that for us. I mean, I'm not saying it's not, it probably will be better at us in certain ways, but it shouldn't be better at us than us culturally, because it doesn't have a culture.
Thank
Sorry, I had a question. Thank you for your talk, by the way. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask basically how you incorporated a sense of like local character and culture into each campus that you worked on. Because at first glance, if I was looking at kind of like closer up pictures of each campus, without any like labels or documentation or anything, I don't think I could differentiate which one belongs, I think, in Switzerland and which one belongs in England just off the bat. So I was wondering if there was anything specific that you did maybe that isn't apparent like right away or at first glance that kind of incorporated a sense of the local place into
Okay.
your design.
I'd be curious, is that a common perception? I mean, I think the stuff in England looks really English and the stuff in Switzerland looks really Italian Swiss.
I'm also just a sophomore, so I don't have a lot of
No.
a lot of
No.
experience,
No,
but
because
that was just
some
the
of it-
first one.
Oh, so it's okay. So building materials, roof pitches, window sashes are really different in those two campuses. So England's all brick, no brick in Switzerland. I mean, not to say there isn't brick in Switzerland, but most traditional buildings in Switzerland are stucco. So all the buildings in Switzerland are stucco. That means they're all painted. All the buildings in England are brick. Most of the buildings around them are brick. Buildings in England have steeper roof pitches. It rains more, the different kind of roof tiles. Window sashes in England tend to have smaller divided lights. Window sashes in Italy and in Ticino tend to have larger divided lights. So everything from the proportions of the window sashes to the roof pitches to the facades actually are different and are based on essentially the local context and yikes.
I might have gotten different images mixed
Okay,
up, but
no.
just I was interested in like specific materials and stuff like that originally. So
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, and unfortunately, I think we'll have to reserve the others for the reception right after this. So here's the last one.
What would you say the role of an architect is in restoration of, like, in a historical sense?
Well, restoration is, interestingly, it's a really modern discipline. I mean, historically, when a building was in bad shape, they just tore it down, built a new one, historically. There are some exceptions. There's the famous line about the Doge's Palace in Venice had a fire in the 1560s. I don't know if you know Palladio did a project for the Doge's Palace, colossal order, probably looked a lot like the Loggia del Capitaniato in Vicenza. And the Doge said, no, we're going to build it as it was, where it was. And that is a very particular kind of choice that was not typical historically, which is why over time, cities who have long arcs of history have a lot of different styles of buildings because buildings look different at different times in history. And when a building fell into disuse, if it was not able to be maintained, if tastes changed, styles changed, they had no problem with simply replacing an older building with a new one. I mean, Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling basically painted over, stars and sky, but people painted over frescoes all the time. The idea of preserving something, I think in general, I mean, the reason preservation is essentially a modern thing, and I mean, in a sense that it's more or less contemporaneous with modernism, is that there was so much destruction of the historic context, and not just with modernism, but also in the 19th century, Haussmann's Paris, that preservation is a reaction against the loss of historic, the historic record, and basically an insecurity of believing that we could operate at that same level. So again, it's a kind of an emulative problem. When you're afraid that whatever new you're going to do is not going to be as good as the old thing, you start preserving the old thing. And I'm not saying we should go around tearing old buildings down. I'm just saying that understanding preservation within a traditional, I mean, the longer arc of classical and traditional culture is really complicated. For example, the idea that you have to add on to an historic building today in a different style in order to distinguish old from new, that happened all the time historically. Gothic buildings had Renaissance doorways added onto them, Baroque chapels inserted later. And that just happened not because people deliberately wanted to distinguish styles, but because styles changed over time. And people didn't think about architecture the same way in the 14th century as they did in the 15th and the 16th. And so there was this kind of natural transformation and evolution. The idea of adding onto something in the same style and extending it is not something people necessarily did historically too. So I think preservation is really complicated. Like when you have a building that's had a long, complex history, I know it's certainly complicated in Italy. To which period do you restore it? You know, is there kind of an ideal moment? You know, this happens with buildings all the time. Ponte Sisto in Rome, when they restored it, they actually got rid of the iron railings because it was designed without railings, and you can't have a pedestrian bridge without railings in the 20th century. So they actually did this, I think, really banal brick parapet thing because it was sort of innocuous and inoffensive, but it's neither sympathetic with the original building, nor is it as nice as the iron railing that they replaced. And so preservation is really hard, which is why I don't do it.
Okay, well, I think that's it. David, thank you for the wonderful lecture.